It was obvious no one knew exactly where the enemy was or what his objective would be. An early recognition of the direction was essential so that the night fighters could be introduced as early as possible into the bomber stream. But the radio reports kept contradicting themselves. Now the enemy was over Amsterdam and then suddenly west of Brussels, and a moment later they were reported far out to sea in Map Square 25. What was to be done? The uncertainty of the ground stations was communicated to the crews. Since this game of hide-and-seek went on for some time, I thought, to hell with them all, and flew straight to Amsterdam. By the time I arrived over the capital, the air position was still in a complete muddle. No one knew where the British were, but all the pilots were reporting pictures on their screens. I was no exception. At 15,000 feet, my sparker announced the first enemy machine in his lee. I was delighted. I swung round onto the bearing in the direction of the Ruhr, for in this way I was bound to approach the stream. Facius proceeded to report 3 or 4 pictures on his screens. I hoped that I should have enough ammunition to deal with them. Then Facius suddenly shouted, "Tommy flying towards us at a great speed, distance decreasing 2,000 yards, 1,500, 1,000, 500. I was speechless. Facius already had a new target. Perhaps it was a German night fighter on a westerly course, I said to myself, and made for the next bomber. It was not long before Facius shouted again, "Bomber coming for us at a hell of a speed, 2,000, 1,000, 500, he's gone." "You're crackers, Facius," I said jestingly. But I soon lost my sense of humour, for this crazy performance was repeated a score of times, and finally I gave Facius such a rocket that he was deeply offended. This tense atmosphere on board was suddenly interrupted by a ground station calling, "Hamburg, Hamburg, 1,000 enemy bombers over Hamburg. Calling all night fighters, full speed for Hamburg." I was speechless with rage. For half an hour I had been weaving about in a presumed bomber stream, and the bombs were already falling on Germany's great port. It was a long way to Hamburg. The Zuider Zee, the Ems and the Weser disappeared below us, and Hamburg appeared in the distance. The city was blazing like a furnace. It was a horrifying sight. On my arrival over the city, the ground station was already reporting the homeward flight of the enemy in the direction of Heligoland. Too late. The flak gunners had already ceased to fire, and the gruesome work of destruction had been accomplished. In low spirits we flew back to our airfield. How could the German defences have been rendered so impotent? We know today. The British had procured an example of our successful lee apparatus and had found the countermeasure. With ridiculous strips of tinfoil, they could now lure the entire German night fighter arm onto false trails and reach their own target unmolested. It was a simple yet brilliant idea. As is well known, radar works on a determined ultra-short wave frequency. By dropping these strips of tinfoil, the British jammed this frequency. In this way, the air goal was achieved, and for the night fighter, the bomber had once more become as invisible as it had been before the invention of the Liechtenstein apparatus. While the main bomber stream far out to sea was flying towards Hamburg, smaller formations had flown over Holland and Belgium to western Germany, dropping millions of tinfoil strips. These laminetta appeared on the German screens as enemy bombers and put various ground stations out of action. The smaller formations, according to schedule, next dropped enormous quantities of flares, the famous Christmas trees, over various cities in the Ruhr. A few bombs were also dropped. The night fighters streaked towards these signs of attack from all directions, looking in vain for the bomber stream. In the meantime, the leaders of the British main raiding force had reached Heligoland unhindered and dropped more strips, putting the ground detectors out of action. At one blow, both ground and air defence had been paralysed. In daylight on the following morning, whole areas of Holland, Belgium and northern Germany were strewn with these strips of foil. Certain people maintained that they were poisonous and that they would kill the cattle. The innocuousness of these small pieces of tinfoil on the ground was soon apparent, but in the air they were deadly, fatal for the life of a whole city. A few days later, we heard further details of the agony of this badly hit city. The raging fires in a high wind caused terrific damage, and the grievous loss of human life outstripped any previous raids. All attempts to extinguish them proved fruitless and technically impossible. The fires spread unhindered, causing fiery storms which reached heats of 1,000 degrees and speeds approaching gale force. The narrow streets of Hamburg, with their countless backyards, were favourable to the flames, and there was no escape. As a result of the dense carpet bombing, large areas of the city had been transformed into a single sea of flame within half an hour. Thousands of small fires joined up to become a giant conflagration. The fiery wind tore the roofs from the houses, uprooted large trees and flung them into the air like blazing torches. The inhabitants took refuge in the air raid shelters, in which later they were burnt to death or suffocated. In the early morning, thousands of blackened corpses could be seen in the burnt-out streets. In Hamburg, one thought was uppermost in every mind: to leave the city and to abandon the battlefield. During the following nights, until 3rd of August 1943, the British returned and dropped on the almost defenceless city about 3,000 blockbusters, 1,200 landmines, 25,000 HE, 3,000 incendiaries, 80,000 phosphorus bombs and 500 phosphorus drums. 40,000 men were killed, a further 40,000 wounded, and 900,000 were homeless or missing. This devastating raid on Hamburg had the effect of a red light on all the big German cities and on the whole German people. Everyone felt it was now high time to capitulate before any further damage was done. But the High Command insisted that the total war should proceed. Hamburg was merely the first link in a long chain of pitiless air attacks made by the Allies on the German civilian population. Shortly after our return from the west to Parchim, we had a little celebration where the drink flowed freely. A fellow pilot from Essen, Peter Spoden, who was very popular in the mess, had to keep going down to the cellar. The old man, Hauptmann Schönert, was on free and easy terms with the whole mess. He remembered his own youth and spoke enthusiastically of his life as a sailor. During a lull in the party, he suddenly stood up, grabbed one of us by the shoulders and dragged him to the window. The last rays of the evening sun were breaking over the cloud banks on the horizon and staining the heavens scarlet. The sky was a riot of colour, from the most delicate blue to fiery red on the rising cloud bank. The evening had fallen and deep peace lay over the land. The CO opened the window to let in the cool air. The pine woods were fragrant. He puffed his cigar with relish and turned to us with a smile. "Boys, you've bitten off a pretty hard chunk. You get into your crates and are swallowed up in the darkness. Some of you return from single combats at thousands of feet above the tortured, burning earth. Each of you flings his life without a murmur into the scales. A bloody hard life. At the age of 20, I lived a carefree, happy one. I sailed the 7 seas as a ship's boy and learnt to appreciate and love other nations. You could find good pals everywhere. We were all flung together in our cargo boats, Britishers, Norwegians, Danes and Germans. At first the atmosphere was very cold, but once we had the first storm behind us, we smiled at each other. During the first days at sea, it was each man for himself, and yet as soon as we began to feel homesick, we grew closer to each other. Soon we were pals and brothers. To hell with all prejudices. Here in the howling storm, when the huge breakers washed the decks and Father Death stood in the bows, was to be found the real League of Nations. We laughed at the raging seas, and this laugh meant confidence and mutual aid in life and death. When the gale blew itself out, we had a breathing space, and we had been granted a new lease of life. On reaching our home port after many months, we had become a community which recognised no difference of people, race or speech. With heavy hearts, we said farewell in the hope that we should never forget comrades who had shared our joys and griefs. I have found the same comradeship among you. We, too, are faced with the same dangers, and yet there's something eating me. There was a bitter look on his face as he said these words. We are destroying ourselves. Our fight is not against the powers of nature for the good of humanity, but an attempt to destroy life with all the new weapons of science. Do not men of our race, perhaps the fair-haired Britishers with whom I sailed in the Bay of Biscay and made friends, sit in their bombers, night after night, turning our cities to ruins? Each does his duty, but don't we thereby aggravate our hatred? At night we see only the enemy bomber and its bright red, white and blue circles. Our cities burn. The bomber must be brought down at all costs, and when it crashes we crow. We only see the bomber burning and not the crew. We only see the emblem laid low, not the youngsters hanging on their straps in their death agony. And then perhaps one day you meet a Tommy who has bailed out. You meet him down below. His eyes have lost the harsh glint of battle. You shake hands, and this handshake is the beginning of a comradeship, born of a life and death struggle. Gratefully he accepts the cigarette you offer. The barrier that divided us has fallen, and two men stand facing each other. Hostility and propaganda have made them enemies, but the common danger of battle has made them friends. Just as here, in a small way, hatred is changed to friendship, may the racial hatred also come to friendship. But the iron carapace in which the nations shroud themselves, the outward symbols of which are emblems and threats, must be swept away. For the more the modern world uses science, the bloodier will the battles become. The more man takes refuge behind armour plating and steel, the greater will be his will to destruction. For this reason, this bloody murder must come to an end. The peoples must lay aside their blood-stained armour, unless the whole world is to be destroyed. All the peoples of the world could live in peace, and this path must be taken together and protected so that they could all rise in judgment against anyone who left the path. Hauptmann Schönert looked up at the darkening sky. Short indeed were these hours of relaxation, for the menace of the British hung like a sword of Damocles over the German cities. They were trying to destroy the heart of Germany from the air. All of us were living under the spell of the approaching catastrophe. This rest period had to be used for training the newcomers. Night after night we flew, practiced and trained, until the recruits could handle their machines with the precision of a sleepwalker. A Lancaster silhouetted while flying over a burning city, a short Sterling that has been forced to land. The glazed cockpit shows traces of gunshot damage. The huge size of the aircraft can be judged by the sentry standing on the starboard wing. A Lancaster that has already flown 28 missions is loaded up with aerial mines for its next attack on a German city. The crew of a Lancaster prepare to board. 7 or 8 men were needed for the command and defence of a large bomber. Aerial mines are just visible in the foreground. A Lancaster in flight. This bomber was the most commonly used RAF aircraft for the purpose. The Handley Page Halifax was the second mass-produced 4-engined British bomber. The Lancaster and Halifax were difficult to tell apart in a night aerial battle, both having a tail unit with twin rudder fin. This Halifax has engines in tandem, the radial engines of a Halifax being warmed up shortly before takeoff. This Halifax came to grief after 12 bombing missions over Germany, with the next mission already marked up. The aluminium of shot-down bombers was melted down at once and used to produce German warplanes. The wreckage of a shot-down Halifax on the morning after a bombing raid. The snout of an Me-110 with 2 Cementos cannons and MGs. The crew member is seen boarding. The pilot is already seated behind his reflector sight. Oberleutnant Martin Becker inspects the tail of a Lancaster bomber shot down by him on 24 September 1943. A formation of Me-110 night fighters, fitted with radar, in flight towards enemy bomber groups. NJG-6 mission briefing on 24 December 1943 at Mainz-Finthen. On the blackboard in the background can be seen the cover names for NJG-6 operational areas. For example, Urban and Tristan for certain map squares. Briefing for an operational mission of NJG-6, during which the weatherman delivers his forecast. Night fighters required careful maintenance. They had the advantage, however, that their operational airfields were mostly in Reich territory, and as a rule, good ground crews were available. a weapons technician checks over a MG-15 used by the rear gunner. It was soon clear that a twin MG was much more effective against British night fighters, and also for making attacks from the rear gunner's position against bombers. Last instructions are given before running the engines and taking off into the pitch-dark night to meet incoming bombers. The Me-110 of Helmut Lent, NJG-1, at takeoff. Lent notched up over 100 night fighter aerial victories. He was awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. Only Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer was more successful, and Me-110 illuminated in attack mode. A British bomber spotted it at the last moment. The profile of a Lancaster bomber emerging from the darkness into the pallid light cast by fires burning below. Oak leaves holder Martin Becker of NJG. 6 behind the armoured glass window of his Me-110. Peter Spoden, centre right, congratulates Wilhelm Jonin, centre left, on an aerial victory. This photograph is from the Propaganda Company report in a 1943 edition of the pictorial magazine Signal. The nightly engines test for an Me-110. Without the dedication of the ground crews, missions would not have been possible. Award of the Knight's Cross to Hauptmann Fellerer in April 1944. 1. Kneeling. 2. Jonin. 3. General Huth. 4. Fellerer. 5. H. Schulte. 6. J. Kraft. 7. Thun. Apparently General Huth. Lent his own Knight's Cross to Fellerer for the ceremony. Peter Spoden, centre, with Helmut Schulte, left, and Joseph Kraft, right, in light-hearted mood, at NJG-6. The plaques listing the names of every NJG-5 pilot who emerged a victor in aerial battle receive a new name in February 1944. The fine wall painting of a Me-110 bears the NJG-5 serial C9, the memorial to fallen members of V NJG-5. Wilhelm Jonin flew with this unit until the beginning of 1944. The men of Z NJG-6 at Neubiberg, 1944. In the bottom row, centre, is Hauptmann Martin Becker, squadron leader. To the right near him is his air gunner, Karl Ludwig Johansson. Funeral at Ingolstadt, Bavaria, in the winter of 1943 for a fallen night fighter pilot. The coffin is flanked by Me-109 day pilots. On 28 April 1944, Wilhelm Jonin made a forced landing in Swiss territory. His Me-110 Liechtenstein radar apparatus was thoroughly examined by Swiss experts at Zurich-Dubendorf. A tail fin of Jonin's Me-110 marking 17 enemy aircraft shot down. Jonin and his crew succeeded in returning to Germany. German night fighter airmen visiting wounded British bomber crews at a German military hospital. A Lancaster bomber that was forced to land and has been totally destroyed by fire. Possibly the crew managed to escape. German night fighters also had many write-offs. Apart from direct losses in aerial combat, there were also many accidents while taking off and landing and crashes due to lack of fuel. Here an Me-110 is in flames. The deadly tinfoil strips came as a tremendous shock to the whole signal service. But the German inventive spirit reacted swiftly, and in feverish haste our radio specialists brought out a new radar apparatus, the SN2, a development of the Liechtenstein. Outwardly, the SN2 was easy to recognize on our machines because the antennae were larger. The nickname barbed wire was now even more appropriate. The SN2 worked on several ultra-short waves so that the operator could change his waves when one particular frequency was jammed. But it required sensitive fingers and a great deal of practice to get the enemy bomber clearly on the screen of the new instrument. The crews flew night after night to improve contact between the pilot and the wireless operator. The CO had ordered a practice operation for that particular night. The large shed doors were set in motion by pressing on an electric button. The harsh light streamed out onto the tarmac in front of the shed and was gradually swallowed up by the huge airfield. The white-painted night fighters stood there with their threatening cannon muzzles blackened by the gunpowder. The aerials on the nose of the machine looked like thin, waving tentacles. The shed was filled with the smell of petrol and oil. A few mechanics were working conscientiously by a spotlight on the engines of C9ES, on whose tail unit were painted 17 bands, representing the number of victories. "Stop work," ordered the chief mechanic. "The squadron is off on target spotting practice. All the machines to the runway." In the meantime, other mechanics had appeared from their huts and were removing the tarpaulins from the planes. The cockpit windows were quickly cleaned, for the slightest speck of dust on the perspex disturbed the night fighter pilot. How often had a young pilot streaked at full speed after one of these specks of dust, until he had to admit that the shadow he thought he saw against the bright night sky drew no nearer. In this way, precious time was lost. Heavy tractors drove up and towed the aircraft out of the sheds on hawsers. Parachute orderlies fetched the air life belts from the drying room and laid them carefully in the cockpit ready to be put on. "Achtung, Achtung! Report on the air situation. A few single-fast bombers have entered West German territory. No formations reported. Weather report, high pressure belt over Western Europe. Light cirrus between 15,000 and 18,000 feet. Wind from 180 to 200 degrees, 6 to 14 mph, 1 day after full moon. The following aircraft will take part in target spotting practice: AS to Sector Heron, DS to Sector Swan, FS to Sector Doe, HS to Sector Bear. KS remains in reserve. Start 01.00 hours. End of message." The lights went out in the shed. Bright moonlight lay over the airfield and made the aircraft look like ghosts. The leading mechanics jumped onto the machines with their torches and made a final check-up of all the instruments and switches. "All set?" asked the chief. "Warm the engines up then. Watch your cooling indicator. Today in this warm air, put your radiator flaps full out." The control lamp went on in the tail. The chief pressed on the self-starter of the starboard engine. "Contact!" "Contact!" replied the mechanics and got out of the way of the propeller. The hum of the power starter grew louder. The blades jerked and bright flames from the unused petrol spurted from the exhaust dimmers. The mixture was too rich, full throttle, and the engine fired. After a brief rattle, it settled down to smooth running. Everything in order. The performance was repeated with the port engine, and now they were both running smoothly. 600 horsepower was housed in each of these steel masterpieces of precision. At intervals, a shudder ran through the whole machine as the petrol and oil pressure gradually rose. A rapid throttling back of the engines, and then the mechanic gradually pushed the throttle full home. The engines roared, and it was impossible to hear a word. The reverend counter needle sprang from 1,500 to 2,700 to 2,800 RPM. No faulty plugs or suspicious noises to be heard. The chief contentedly reduced the gas. A red flash of his torch informed the second mechanic, who jumped beneath the gondola and pulled out the cutout device. The blades turned anti-clockwise. Soon all the aircraft had been checked. The chief could report to HQ that everything was set. Here, in the central combat station, the brain of the night fighter arm, were hundreds of telephone lines. Hardly a minute passed before a pilot somewhere in the dark sky was given the course and position of an aircraft. In a matter of seconds, the fighter was thrown onto a big frosted glass panel as a bright green dot, with his exact position, course, and altitude. As soon as one entered the antechambers of the combat station, one was impressed by a buzzing and droning of radio apparatus, alternating with the ringing of telephone bells. Experienced signals staff made contact in a few seconds with the remotest observation posts. All the cables ran to the central command table. The room was lit by indirect lighting and looked slightly eerie. Involuntarily the eye fell on bright transparent signs: enemy activity, rest, target spotting practice. The air situation was shown on this board. At the present moment, the green sign, rest, was showing. An electric clock gave the exact time. It was 01.15. Then a shrill alarm bell rang. Sleepy soldiers and intelligence airwomen poured out of the waiting rooms and hurried to their posts. All weariness vanished as soon as they heard the engines revving up on the tarmac as the young pilots were getting ready for the operation. 2 hours of duty lay ahead of them, and they had to be wide awake. Upon their accurate work depended the success of the ops, and perhaps the lives of these young airmen. Each soldier, each airwoman, knew the radio operators and the gunners of the individual machines only too well. The colonel came in full of energy. All the officers, soldiers, and airwomen were at their posts. The colonel took his place at the centre of the command table, his eyes on the large, smooth panel on which now the night fighter sectors, Heron, Swan, Doe, and Bear, had lit up. All the cities, villages, rivers, and lakes of importance were clearly defined. "All lines clear?" the colonel asked his adjutant, who sat next to him. "Jawohl, Herr Oberst. All contacts checked. The direct lead to the fighter controller in Heron is functioning badly, but we have run a jury lead over Swan." "Thank you. That's fine." There were 80 to 100 levers on the command table. A light pressure on them sufficed to get telephonic communication over hundreds of miles. To the right of the big frosted glass panel was a board on which were posted the crews with their aircraft numbers, takeoff and landing times. On the left was a glass Fluco map with indirect lighting showing the whole German territory, embracing Holland, Belgium, France, and the Channel coast. On this map, all enemy aircraft that had been spotted by radar sets, listening posts, and reconnaissance planes were shown in their position, course, and number. That evening, only a few fast bombers making for Berlin were reported. They were the newest type Mosquitoes, vastly superior to our night fighters. 0 hour -5. Order to all night fighter sectors. Switch on all Freya and Würzburg apparatus. Microphones ready. All lines to be branched to the command table. The liaison officer came in with the fighter controller. The latter went straight to the tower. An operator was already in communication with the crews in the aircraft. As Anton Siegfried, flown by pilot Unteroffizier Zawadzka, reported. "Meteor from Thrush 36. Come in, please." "Thrush 36 from Meteor. Victor, I can hear you well. Turn down your amplifier." "Victor, taxi to the starting point. Christmas tree." This was the code word for the airfield lights to be switched on. In quick succession, the controlling officer switched on the flare path, obstacle and horizon lights, and the revolving beam. From the control tower, all these red, green, and white lights looked like fairyland. The moonlight was so bright that one could have read a newspaper. It was a pleasure for the young pilots to take off in such weather. As was at the starting point by the 2 white lamps. The fighter controller telephoned once more for the air situation. All clear. A green flare gave the signal to start. 0, and the first machine took off, followed in quick succession by the others. The engines roared, the 6-ton crates were underway and quickly got up speed. After a run of 800 yards, the airspeed indicator showed 80 km/h. Stick slowly back and the machine was airborne. Zawadzka kept his eyes glued to his blind flying instruments. It was difficult to have complete confidence in these instruments and to refrain from looking outside to get one's bearings from the cloud banks or the ground. Many a young pilot had done this, stalled his aircraft, and crashed into the ground from a low height. Zawadzka did not make this mistake. Automatically his hand reached for the switches and took the necessary precautions. Wing flaps and undercarriage retracted. The machine climbed rapidly to 1,000 to 1,500 feet. Thrush 36 from Meteor rang out over the air. "Meteor from Thrush 36. Everything in order. Making for Sector Heron." In the combat room, everything was now in full swing. The sector ground stations had already reported the arrival of the night fighters and promptly gave their position in code. After decoding, the position was pinpointed on the squared map and projected onto the big panel. The green dot lit up. As though attracted by a magnet, it swung slowly to the centre of the prescribed sector. "That's gone off all right again," breathed the colonel with relief. "It's astonishing how quickly these airwomen out in their posts have worked. Signals seem to be in their blood." One green dot after the other lit up on the panel. All the fighters were in radio communication with the ground stations and had reached 12,000 feet. As flown by Zawadka was on its way to the Baltic coast. The green dot was just off the coast. The colonel decided to make a test. A slight pressure on one of the many switches sufficed to connect him with Sector Heron. "Put me in touch with the fighter on the ground-to-aircraft line." "Wait a minute. The communication is disturbed by enemy transmission. We'll transfer you to another frequency." The CO put on his headphones and waited for a moment. The aircraft duly reported. Calm reigned in the control room. "Thrush 36 from Meteor. Your position directly over the coast, course 106 to green, altitude 13,450 feet. Out." The fighter immediately repeated the message from control. It was a magnificent achievement on the part of signals. Meteor headquarters was in a position to direct with great accuracy as many as 30 night fighters. This was a great relief for the crews in the air and a lightning-swift defence against strong formations of enemy aircraft. The night fighter could pursue the enemy unhindered over the Baltic, the North Sea, Holland or France, as far as the English coast. He could change course as he pleased. A brief question to Meteor and he could learn his exact position. Even more, perhaps his machine had been badly hit in action and was not in a position to get back to the airfield on its own devices. Then the pilot would send out his SOS, and control would immediately begin to work at feverish speed. The liaison officer then took over. A glance at the panel showed him the position of the damaged machine. He marked it on the distress map, which showed all airfields with their size, illumination, and obstacles. Within 30 seconds, with the aid of protractors, triangles, and tables, he had worked out the course with all details for the nearest airfield. In another 30 seconds, the ground-to-air communication, Meteor to machine in distress, was functioning. While the machine set its course for the airfield, the controlling officer there was informed by long-distance telephone that the damaged night fighter would be landing. Beacons were switched on to show the pilot the direction of the field. Rockets rose in the air, bursting like bunches of grapes. On clear nights, these radishes could be seen 15 to 20 miles away, making it easy to spot the airfield. Obviously, when it was dark and low cloud hid the ground, when the rain beat against the windows of the aircraft and the pilot had to rely on his phosphorescent blind-flying instruments, the best organised intelligence service in the world could not help. When gusts of wind at gale force flung the machine about the sky, when in a fraction of a second the propellers, wings and engines were swathed in thick, heavy ice, then the machine, with racing engines, risked a fatal crash into the ground. When devilish St. Elmo's fire began to dance on the aerials, cockpit panes and propellers, blinding the pilot, his eyes could not see a yard in the darkness. In these moments is born the airman who overcomes the powers of nature by his own willpower. Now he must either plunge through the bad weather and crash with his crew into the teeming witch's cauldron, or win through into the clear, storm-free sky. Pilots trust in God far more than people would believe. With each happy landing, they know that their life has been spared once more, the life they are willing to sacrifice for their country. The propellers of AS threshed the icy air calmly and peacefully at 12,000 feet. Not a cloud in the sky to interfere with the visibility. Below, on the dark, far-off earth, the rivers and lakes gleamed magnificently in the moonlight. The stars paled in the bright moonlight. Bitter cold seeped through the cannon apertures into the cockpit. The crews shivered in their fur jackets. Zawadka turned on the heating in his flying suit. The electricity warmed gloves and boots and brought some relief. "Why doesn't the ground station answer any more?" he asked over the RT. "Probably a transmission fault. I'll tune into Swan. Swan from Thrush 36. Come in, please." Swan Station replied immediately. "Thrush 36 from Swan. I can hear you well. Remain on my frequency. Fighter approaching." "We must take great care," said the gunner dryly. "Otherwise there'll be some sharp shooting or he'll ram us. I'll put a red flare in the pistol in case he comes too close." Swan to Thrush 36. You're flying too fast. Reduce speed. Zawadka pulled back his throttle. The result was not long delayed. Once more an angry voice called from below. Buzzard 30, you clod! You've overshot your opponent! Zawadka was delighted. In actual fact, he had seen his pursuer as he streaked past at great speed. Meteor headquarters ordered a changeover of tactics. Zawadka was now the pursuer. The controlling officer from Sector Swan reported in a hoarse voice, Thrush 36, show fighter recognition signal Frederick, full throttle, course 360, enemy aircraft 14 miles ahead, altitude 13,650 feet. Out! The engines roared. Automatically the control lamp flashed the code sign F, a sign that the ground radar had picked up the night fighter and was leading him accurately to within 100 yards of his adversary. The airspeed indicator needle rose constantly. Attention! Attention! Thrush 36. Enemy aircraft changing course. Course 295. It was now quiet in the aircraft. The wireless operator switched on his SN2. Invisibly, the electric waves explored the air ahead of the aircraft, capturing everything in their path. The operator followed the pictures carefully in his cathode ray tubes. The harsh blue glittering band flickered before his eyes. No changes appeared. Suddenly he shouted, "I've got him!" "You bloody clod," grumbled the gunner. "You don't have to shout as though the machine were on fire." Almost invisible to the untrained eye, a small zigzag had appeared in the tubes. The adversary. Slowly, it travelled to the right, for the aircraft was flying on a right-hand turn. The operator now gave his driver a stream of measurements and led him to the target. The zigzags appeared quite clearly in the tubes. Now the gunner roared at the top of his voice, "I can see him! There he goes!" Zawadka nearly jumped out of his seat at this Indian war cry. He swore loudly. "Pull yourself together. What do you mean? There he goes. I want to know where he's flying." "There he goes," was the reply. "Can't you see the shadow?" Zawadka was furious, but it was no use cursing. He asked his gunner quite calmly, "Can you still see him?" "Yes, there he goes." "To starboard or port?" "To starboard, of course, a bit higher than us." It was by no means of course for Zawadka, for his eyes could see nothing but the starry sky. He banked gently to the right and gained height. Suddenly he himself roared, "I can see him! I can see him!" In his delight, he let go of the control column and slapped himself on the knee, for this was the first aircraft he had ever seen on a night flight. The ghost-like shadow of his opponent continued to fly across the night sky, and its outlines were now clearly recognizable. Zawadka could see the red-hot exhaust pipes and sparks coming from the engines. Occasionally the wings, tail unit and body were distinguishable in the moonlight. He was still 80 yards away. A short burst in the petrol tank would have been sufficient to turn the opponent into a blazing torch. The cockpit roof glittered in the moonlight. Zawadka pressed in closer to 40 and 20 yards. At last he was spotted. The other pilot switched on his position lamps and dipped his wings. "He must have been asleep," said the radio operator. "If he flies like that in the enemy bomber stream, he'll soon be in the next world." "Break off the operation," called the ground station. Zawadka began to lose height and set course for home. The control from the ground is the key to the whole night fighter defence. It sets the tasks and shows how they are to be solved. Without it, there would presumably be only a sequence of fortuitous and unconnected single combats. It is difficult to get a true conception of this fighter control. When one thinks of the vast spaces covered by night fighter squadrons on ops, one can only compare it with the strategy used by the General Staff. And yet this is an unsatisfactory comparison, for controlling in the air has to reckon with quite different factors. To begin with, the speed at which the movements of friend and foe are carried out in the combat zone. When one considers that the average speed of the bomber formations was 250 men to ph, and that the distance between London and Berlin is only 560 miles, one soon realises how quickly a position can change in an air battle. 2 or 3 minutes delay in the reports from signal services or as a result of wrong orders meant 10 to 15 miles flight. That could be quite long enough to make a night fighter in a good position miss his enemy. It was vital to recognise at an early stage the intention of the enemy. To achieve this, the individual observations from the frontiers of Europe had to reach the combat stations at lightning speed. Time also had to be allowed for checking the details. Here, also at lightning speed, they had to be decoded and translated into orders. The enemy naturally knew this, and his main task, therefore, was to disguise his intentions as long as possible to hamper the defence. In addition to the actual combat, the signal service had to wage a bitter struggle with their apparatus. The enemy flew towards several points. He flew in zigzags, made feint attacks, and tried to jam the frequencies. All this was a great strain on the nerves. The British once maintained that 600,000 men took part in an air battle. This figure may be right or wrong, but one thing is certain. Each of the men had to be not only a specialist, but also a man in perfect health. Tired and sleepy, the crews slumped in their armchairs. Chessboards lay abandoned, and only soft music could be heard on the wireless during the night hours. The hands of the clock wandered towards 02 hours. A few of the crews had retired to their bunks in full flying kit, ready at any moment to scramble. A dim red light gave a cosy tone to the room and accustomed the night fighter pilot's eyes to the darkness. In this way, the human eye needed but 5 minutes to adapt itself to complete darkness, whereas normally the eye needs 20 minutes. Some of the men had fallen asleep with their heads on the table, and one pilot was still holding the book he had been reading when he dozed off. All tensions had disappeared from their features. There was a slight crackle in the telephone. This barely audible noise roused some of them. Still half drunk with sleep, an ensign took up the receiver. His features hardened. "Jawohl, Herr Oberst. Division suspects enemy mine-laying operation over the Baltic. Several reports of aircraft over the North Frisian Islands. Thank you." In a flash, the ensign's words had been grasped by the crews. It was almost incomprehensible that these words alone could have roused the deepest sleepers. All eyes were on the CO, who was rubbing his eyes. He jumped up, got in touch with control, and gave orders for 3 aircraft to get ready to take off. We all pored over the map, eagerly discussing the chances of bringing down a mine layer. The wireless operators checked their frequencies, tables, the weather, signals, and ammunition. No one as yet knew who would be sent that night over the Baltic to protect our shipping from further losses. "It's damned late, boys," said Hauptmann Schönert, "but the Tommy is always unpredictable. I'm going to take a flip. Who's coming?" Everyone volunteered. "Well, Oberfähnrich Grond, you've got to be blooded sometime. Perhaps you'll be lucky tonight. Full sea rescue kit in case you're shot down over the water. Keep tuned into the air rescue frequency. Naturally, you have to help the enemy if he should fall into the drink. Any more questions?" There was a silence. The telephone rang shrilly. "2 crews for immediate takeoff. Be careful of flagship fire." Those who remained behind wished the hunters good luck. In the meantime, the CO, Grond, and their crews made their way in the moonlight to their machines. Schönert quickly put on a Mae West, fastened the securely packed dinghy to his parachute, and checked the light flares, colour pouch, tracer ammunition, provisions, and rescue flags. A slow waltz was being broadcast. The last cigarettes were being smoked when the music suddenly stopped. "Achtung! Starting orders for both machines. Mine-laying aircraft already over Schleswig-Holstein. 8 to 12 bombers. Achtung! Achtung! Take off immediately." Hannes Richter, the veteran wireless operator, was fiddling with his radio apparatus, convinced that he would not be of much help to the old man on this trip, for the mine-laying aircraft flew too low to be picked up in the SN2. But Hannes was optimistic. He could rely on the CO's good scent for a scrap. A short hum of the starter and the engines started. A green lamp lit up, the Do-217 got slowly underway and was soon roaring down the flare path towards the red obstacle lights. Just before reaching them, it was airborne and vanished into the night. "Everything okay, Hannes?" "Everything okay, sir." Control ordered them to sector Heron, and then on course 300. The enemy altitude 15,000 feet, speed 240 mph. The engines droned rhythmically. Schonert had already loaded his cannon. A button pressed on the instrument panel introduced the first death-dealing shots into the barrels. 8 red lamps lit up. The time was 03.0. Lake Schwerin lay in deep sleep. In the distance, a bright strip of water glittered on the horizon. The Baltic. "Achtung! White thrush! Express! Express!" The old man pushed the throttle forward, and the engines responded nobly. Now began the test of nerves. The white horses on the sea below looked beautiful in the moonlight, but the slightest contact with the water would smash the machine into 1,000 pieces. To hit the water is more dangerous than to hit the earth. Radio communication with the Heron ground station grew clearer. Schonert gained height. Suddenly he gave a start. What was that below? Slowly and indolently, something milky grey was spreading over the sea, swallowing up the gleaming surface, towering hundreds of feet above the water and steadily approaching. Fog. The machine streaked above the damp white veil. Now only the precision altimeter gave the true altitude above the water, which was perhaps a few feet below the grey shroud. "Achtung! White thrush! Enemy aircraft circling in map square X and losing height." Hannes quickly reported the position of his machine, took his compass and set square to give his pilot the new course. Distance from the enemy 5 miles. Then he removed the safety release of the SN2. After a minute's warming up fine, almost invisible, jagged lines appeared in the cathode ray tube. "The enemy must soon appear in the gadget," said Hannes quietly. He stared at the glittering band, which was shaded on all sides in order not to dazzle the pilot. Slowly he turned the switch, trying to catch the banking foe in the exploring beams. "Go down a bit lower. Throttle back." Hauptmann Schonert obeyed. Then a miracle of science took place. A fine, small line appeared in the tube. It was the enemy mine layer. "He's banking!" shouted Hannes in great excitement over the RT. "Distance 1.5 miles. Throttle down." Schonert scanned the pale horizon like a lynx and did alternate aileron turns to left and right. The fog had disappeared, the best opportunity for mine-laying aircraft to drop their eggs from a low altitude. The jagged line grew larger, wandered to the left, remained stationary for a moment, wandered further left, sinking all the time. "Enemy banking over the same spot and losing height. Probably just about to drop his mine. Distance 1,000 yards, reported Hannes. "Switch off the radar. Keep your eyes skinned and radio silent," whispered Schonert, as though he were close enough for the Tommy to hear him. A deathly silence on board. Head bent well forward, he peered through the thick, bulletproof perspex at the sea. The altimeter now showed 1,200 feet. The water was once more spangled in the moonlight. In the far distance, the dawn was about to break. The old man removed the safety catch from his guns. He had spotted the enemy, but not a word came from his lips. However, his crew knew it, for they could always tell by his face and his behaviour when he had spotted his victim. He banked sharply, lost 300 feet, and suddenly a large black shadow appeared. The 4-engined bomber was cruising over the Baltic, still nursing the heavy mines in its bays, unaware of the danger. It spread its 120-foot wings like a bird as it lost height. The huge fuselage and the tall tail unit with the red, white and blue circles were easily recognizable. The crew of 8 must have thought themselves quite safe here so far away from the coast. But at last the Tommy spotted his pursuer, a German night fighter at 600 feet above the sea, too low to bail out. Nevertheless, the Britisher was tough. He did not give up hope. At the last moment he did a steep right-hand climbing turn, showing all his exhausts. The rear gunner fired a burst with all his guns, but Schonert was an old hand at the game and had been in this position before. At the very moment the enemy zoomed, he pushed the stick forward. The tracers went over his head. He streaked at an incredible speed over the water and then zoomed. At the same moment the enormous black shape came into his sights, grew larger, and a burst from 8 cannons entered the fuselage, tore it open, damaged the engines and set the petrol tanks on fire. A long, sinister flame trailed away below the wings of the night fighter. The crew insisted that they could feel the heat of the explosion in their cockpits. In the last second, Schonert had broken off the engagement when he was perhaps no more than 15 feet away from the flames. He gave a sigh of relief. The giant 4-engined bomber was still in the air, but the red flames were licking the engines. Soon they spread to all parts of the aircraft. This dying enemy was a gruesome sight. Spellbound, the crew watched the blazing Halifax, which was still trailing flames like a comet. Once more the burning wings rose in the air. The blunt perspex nose, in which the pilot was still at his controls, was outlined against the sky. Then it turned on its back and crashed with a monstrous explosion into the sea. A pilot's death. A sailor's death. Upset by his opponent's courageous end, Hauptmann Schonert's voice trembled as he gave his report. Heron from White Thrush, mine-laying aircraft shot down in Map Square X. The hunt continues. He circled once more over the silvery waves which followed each other in innocence, although a few seconds before they had dragged 8 men down into the depths. Only a large dark patch of oil betrayed the grim combat which had taken place over the open sea under a clear moonlit sky. The German capital, with its 5 million inhabitants, had so far been spared the mass raids. On the night of 23-24, August 1943, the RAF carried their air offensive to Berlin, a distance of 560 miles. "All crews in readiness!" the order rang out over the loudspeakers on Parchim airfield. It came as a surprise. The crews rushed from their quarters and ran to their machines. Something was in the air. A bare 5 minutes later, the whole wing was ready to take off. 23:06 hours. Orders to take off. I was the first to be airborne and climbed at full throttle to 15,000 feet. The night was bright and therefore in favour of the defence. In such weather at 15,000 to 18,000 feet, the pilot has a field of some 350 miles. Flying over Hanover, for example, I could see the Hamburg flak in action, bombs dropping in Berlin, fires in Leipzig, and incendiaries falling on Cologne. Between these cities, I could see the gleaming network of flashing beacons, the dazzling searchlight cones, and the square markers of night fighter airfields. For the German night fighter, the homeland was an open book, which he had no difficulty in reading. The ground stations reported advance enemy units over the Baltic. The signals service on Fehmarn Island reported strong enemy formations flying at 15,000 feet in a southwesterly direction. I knew that before each large-scale raid, the British agreed upon a well-known landmark as their assembly point. A glance at the map was enough to recognise this as Lake Müritz. I circled at 15,000 feet and let my SN2 explore the air in the neighbourhood. Soon the first parachute flares fell and lit up the dark night. They swayed slowly earthwards, lighting up the mirror-calm surface of the lake. The British Master of Ceremonies had done a good job, I thought, as I waited for the things that were bound to happen. 2 more parachute flares were dropped. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and then suddenly red tracers and flash bombs, which dazzled the eye. The firework display began. Without a break, the Tommies dropped flash bombs to blind the night fighters. The ground station reported the assembly of strong enemy formations northwest of Berlin. I was convinced that the raid would start from here. My fellow pilots had also made for the marker flares, and it could only be a matter of minutes before the neighbouring wings turned up at the Britishers' assembly point. The British assembly, according to our experience, lasted about half an hour. Each wave had been given its exact altitude. This operation demanded the greatest discipline and self-control, but was incidentally a great strain on the nerves of the British crews. But upon a perfect assembly over the agreed starting point depended the success of the raid and the lives of the crews. Not until the dispersed formations had assembled in good order did the Commodore give the order to proceed. Minute by minute, one wave after the other flew at graded altitudes towards the target. I could clearly sense the unrest in the air. 600 enemy bombers were circling over the lake with tons of bombs in their bays, and among them were perhaps 100 German and 50 British long-distance night fighters. Shortly before the raid, the division ordered us to pursue the enemy to the capital and to ignore their own flak, which had permission to fire as high as 24,000 feet. My crew gasped. "This is going to be fun," said Facius, fiddling about with his SN2. "No need to get the wind up," said Mahler the gunner. "They're only firing with blanks today. Wade in, Herr Oberleutnant. If my wife, who lives in Berlin, hears that I'm in this show, I shall get a proper rocket." I let them both go on gossiping and loaded my guns. Just as I was about to go into the attack, Facius reported that his SN2 was out of action. Now, what was to be done? The only solution was to fly with the bomber stream over the city to try to spot the furniture vans with our naked eyes. My comrades were already engaged with the enemy, and the first bombers were going down in flames towards the lake. A wild exchange of fire was going on all around me. Tracers streaked across the sky. On the stroke of midnight, the British Commodore gave the signal to begin the raid by firing orange tracers. Wave after wave advanced in the direction of Berlin. I, too, flew at 18,000 feet towards the capital. Now everything was quiet, and the night enfolded the city in its protective veil. And yet the storm must break loose any moment. The city was protected by the heaviest flak batteries and the best searchlight teams. Tall flak towers hurled death and destruction at the enemy. The path of the Tommies was marked with the wreckage of burning aircraft. 40 or 50 four-engined bombers must already have paid the ultimate penalty before reaching the target. And yet the performance which now started over the city defied all human description. Hell was let loose. A sea of searchlights lit up the night. Thousands of flak guns poured their lead into the air. The British Master of Ceremonies had already marked the targets with incendiaries. West and southwest Berlin were the initial targets. I could not help admiring the nerve of the Pathfinder who, far ahead of his stream and alone in these fireworks, carried out his task with the utmost calm, marking point by point the areas to be bombed with his incendiaries. Soon the points of attack and the quarters of the town to suffer were clearly visible to the oncoming waves. What the crews had learnt in scores of raids now became the gruesome reality. Carpet bombing. Berlin defended itself magnificently. The brightly lit night was dotted with thousands of flak bursts up to 24,000 feet. I flew right into a salvo and was flung about the sky by the blast. But I got through. Right and left, above and below me, burning machines rocketed earthwards. Countless fires had sprung up below. Damaged night fighters fired their distress signals. Enemy bombers exploded in the air, spraying the city with a bright-coloured rain of gleaming confetti. A grandiose fireworks display. The constant bursting of the flak shells tortured my nerves. The acrid stench of gunpowder entered the cockpit. The night fighters were engaged with the enemy. Here, over Berlin, radar was superfluous. We could see the enemy circling over the city with our naked eyes. No one lacked a target. Red, yellow, and green tracers tore through the air past my cockpit. In this inferno it was all a matter of luck, for death lurked on every side. Shortly after 1 o'clock, a four-engined Halifax crossed my path. I attacked immediately with no heed for the defence and fired at its petrol tanks. The bomber exploded and fell to earth in a host of burning fragments. 1:03. 5 minutes later I saw a pair of huge shark fins just below me. I had already recognized it as my old friend the Sterling with the dangerous rear gunner. The enemy bomber grew larger in my sights, and the rear gunner was sprayed by my guns and silenced just as he opened fire. The rest was merely a matter of seconds. At 01:08, this heavy bomber fell like a stone out of the sky and exploded on the ground. The nightmare came to an end. The Britishers were on the way home. I circled over the burning city, waiting for stragglers. The flak guns fell silent. Huge fires lit up the night. The crew was silent. We could not get it into our heads that our capital, Berlin, was doomed. After this battle in the heart of Germany, we all knew that the hour of victory had passed and that Hitler only wanted to gain time. But was there any sense in brooding over this? We cast a glance at the burning city and set our course for Parchim. I landed after a flight of 3 hours and 4 minutes. My Meter 110 had received a few shell splinters, but the ground staff were delighted with our success. Our wing had accounted for 20 bombers. The following day, the Wehrmacht communiqué announced a terror raid on Berlin and claimed 100 bombers shot down. Good, but what of the other 500? They would refuel when they got home and continue to fly until Berlin was a heap of rubble. Raid after raid was launched against Berlin. Our wing, which had previously been well behind the line, was now in the centre of the defence zone. Night after night we sat at readiness in our machines, and then, when the first bombs fell on our brightly lit airfield and fast British bombers strafed our installations with cannon and machine guns, we knew that in Germany there was now no safe rear-line position. With round-the-clock bombing by the Allied bomber streams, the Reich itself had become a gigantic battlefield. According to a predetermined plan of attack, Berlin was sinking into dust and ashes. On their nightly forays, the Allies no longer needed to search for the capital, for the huge fires of the previous night were still blazing and lighting up the darkness. A blood-red glow lay over Berlin for weeks and months on end. After these heavy raids, many pilots landed at Parchim from the Dutch and Belgian zones, and among them Oberstleutnant Lent, the German night fighter ace. As pilot in a destroyer group, this young airman made his first kill in the Polish campaign. In the air battle of December 1939, over the Heligoland Bight, he accounted for 3 of the enemy. In 1941, Lent went over to night fighting and was successful from the start at shooting down the bombers. He became the terror of the bomber streams. Lent remained a few hours with us. In brief words, this young group commander described his successful combats over Berlin. His machine was refueled and ready to take off once more. One never knew. Perhaps the British would launch another raid in the early morning hours. Lent fortified himself with a glass of red wine and ate a snack. He did not even bother to take off his flying suit to get a little rest. A quick telephone conversation with his headquarters, and he learnt the numbers of the enemy brought down and his own losses. Hardly had he replaced the receiver than the chief mechanic reported that his machine was airworthy. Lent said goodbye with a word of thanks for our hospitality and streaked away in search of new successes. Obituary. On 31st July 1944, this young lieutenant colonel was the 15th officer in the German forces to be awarded the diamonds to his Knight's Cross. 2 months later, he was killed, undefeated by the enemy. He met an airman's death with his crew. While testing a new night fighter, the port engine suddenly fell out as he banked, and Lent with his crew crashed into the ground from 150 feet. In January 1944, the Battle of Berlin reached its peak. The British used its bomber formations with intelligence. In so-called backhanded weather, when the skies were clear over the British Isles, and there was low-lying cloud at a few hundred feet over Germany, the enemy bombers took off and flew towards their targets without ever seeing the ground. This was the case on the night of 27th January 1944. The Met reported a cloud ceiling of 150 feet with solid cloud up to 13,000 feet. From 3,000 feet there was danger of icing. A fine snow fell, covering with a coat of ice the machines, which started cold. There could be no lagging at the start, and we had to be in the air within a minute, or else the engine would probably fail. The night was pitch black. Our new CO, Hauptmann Bär, inspected the weather. Absolute pea soup outside. "You can't see your hand before your nose," he said as he returned to the waiting room and detailed the crews. Only 10 out of the 30 pilots would take off if there were an alert. A landing at Parchim was out of the question. The only airfield open was Leipzig-Brandes, where the ceiling was 1,500 feet. We waited anxiously, listening each hour to the report of our weather frog. But there was no change. Sleet continued to fall, and it was pleasant to pass the time in the warm, playing a friendly game of scat. The Allies, however, upset our calculations. Lieutenant Kamprath, familiarly known as Brinos, had been briefed that evening as radio operator to the CO, whose own operator was on leave. Now our reservist Brinos had a wife and children. No wonder, then, that he hopped excitedly from one telephone to the other asking for the air situation. I myself had only my own skin to worry about, but I had full confidence in my machine and in my own capabilities. I made a mental note that if it came to a takeoff, once my wheels were off the ground, I would not look out of the machine again, but rely entirely upon my blind flying instruments. Any other course was fatal. Brinos grew calmer. "Take it easy. The Tommy couldn't come in this muck. He's not quite tired of life yet. In this pea-soup fog, even his radar would not help him." We consoled ourselves by agreeing, but in our heart of hearts we were far from convinced. With their latest radar apparatus, the Allies could find almost any target, even at no ceiling or with a ground mist. The picture of the landscape unwound on a special screen, as though with a film camera before the navigator's eyes. It was a top secret. The German scientists had racked their brains to discover how the British could bomb accurately through the thick cloud, until by some lucky chance they discovered this miraculous instrument in a bomber which had been shot down near Rotterdam. There was no possibility of really jamming this apparatus. An aerial photo of Berlin from 15,000 feet through a cloud bank of 9,000 feet showed clearly and in detail every street, every large square, and above all the Tempelhof airfield. This new British achievement was common knowledge, and that is why we were afraid of an attack that night. Only the Berliners might feel protected by the weather. What could happen? They could hardly find their own front doors with the aid of a torch. Our CO was also restless, and there was a certain tension in the air. If things did not happen quickly, this period of waiting would be too much of a strain. My crew, Oberfeldwebel Mahler and Unteroffizier Faccius, looked at me as though they wanted to say, "Well, sir, do you think you could get away with it in this weather, or has the time come for us to make our wills?" Since I could not bear this mood, I ordered my crew to get into the machine and await further developments. Poldi Fellerer, number V squadron leader, followed suit. "Where are you off to?" asked the CO as we left the hut. Poldi replied that we would get accustomed to the darkness in our aircraft and warm up the instruments. The mechanics in their huts were quite amazed when they heard our decision. "You're not thinking of taking off in this, are you, sir? Even the chief's left his bicycle at home and has come on foot." We had to laugh as we climbed into the cockpit. I switched on all my instruments and gave them a thorough check-up. Faccius fiddled with his apparatus and tuned into the notorious Calais station. The sugary sweet music was suddenly interrupted by the well-known V sign, and we heard the announcer say, "Berlin, you were once the most beautiful city in the world. Berlin, look out for 11 o'clock tonight." We were dumbfounded. I rushed to the telephone and got put through to the CO. "The Calais radio has just warned its friends of a raid tonight about 11 o'clock. The whole squadron repaired to their machines. The clock on my instrument panel showed 20 more hours. At this moment, a green flare was fired from the control tower. Starting orders at last. The CO's machine stood next to mine. I can still see Hauptmann Bär busy at work in the half-dark machine, while Brinos checked his contact with the other crews on the RT. Everyone answered. Brinos ended with, Well, happy landings all. I was all set to take off, but it was a point of honour that the CO should take off first.